So the GDP growth rate has been as fast or faster under Biden, no matter how you slice it. So even if you start where he was in the second quarter of 2022 and you go till today, remember 2022, that second quarter is when we had regained the jobs level from before the pandemic. So even if you start there, we're still doing better, or same or better than Trump, and a lot better than Trump in his full term. Even by the end of Trump's term, he had recovered to the pre-pandemic level. The first quarter of 2021, we had recovered in GDP. We recovered that faster, but still, mediocre growth under him overall. And then Biden doing very well there. The US has also done better than the other countries in the G7 by a lot. This is the cumulative real, meaning real. Whenever you see that word real, that means inflation adjusted. So real growth from before the pandemic till now, where our economy is about 11% bigger, and Canada's the next at 5.5%, and so on. So we've really come through this thing very strongly compared to the rest. And you can think of real GDP as your income, aggregate income for the country. Technically, that's real GDI, but the numbers are basically identical. It's production or income, however you want to look at it, it's up. With inflation, we've had the same rate of inflation for the last 3 months or so. So these are price changes versus the prior month. So each month they've been 0.2% more expensive than the prior. If you multiply that by 12 approximately, that gives you the year inflation, about 2.4. We've been at a 2.4 rate for the last 3 months annualized, and that's very reasonable rate of inflation. We had a couple months of zero, even one that was negative earlier in the year. In other words, in June, stuff was cheaper than May. But again, this is still, as we shared earlier, things are a lot more expensive than they were in 19 in terms of prices, but with wages, that's debatable. Here's the 2.4% versus a year earlier, and 3.3 for the core. The core excludes food and energy. Those are more volatile. I think you can use whether you use the core or the all, either one. The core is still being a little stubborn. It actually popped upward a little bit, and the all is down. And what this core is mostly rent. For the last year and a half, it's been mostly rent. The services are some of it. Rent weighs very heavily, and I'll show you that here. This last column is how much prices are higher than a year ago as of September, so 12 months ending September. Everything else on here is versus the prior month. So this September column is how much more expensive stuff was versus August. And then this last column over here on the right is the full year. And what you can see is a lot of these numbers are pretty small. The energy is negative for the most part. That's the gas prices. And then you've got the big guy here, though, shelter, which weighs very heavily in that core inflation measure, 4.9%. That is kicking us pretty hard. The transportation services includes things like car insurance. Right underneath that, the 8.5, that's another one that's very expensive. Pretty much cars now are being made to make a car safer. One of the things you do is you make it out of a lot of parts that crumble on impact. And this may seem strange, but it reduces the impact on the passenger. And so cars get totaled. Smaller accidents result in cars getting totaled. And so you're seeing a lot of this increase in the cost. Cars also have a lot more gadgets in them. And that's part of why that's happening. This shows you kind of what is driving the inflation, and the core services, that is that blue section, that's what's driving it. And core services is mostly the rent. And you can see over time how it's been different things contributing, like gas prices were for a long time, and then they became negative. Food has been pretty consistent, but not much lately. As I was showing, let me go back a page here. Food prices at home, the groceries, have been flat or negative over the past year. That popped a little bit in September, but prices for groceries are 1.3% above a year ago. So the big inflation in groceries was not in the past year. It was before that. But you can see the different components, the goods, like coming through as when the services were all bottled up and you couldn't go to a restaurant. People were buying like crazy from Amazon, and that's where you saw the inflation in the goods. You also had the supply chain disruptions, and that's gone away. Supply chains have come back to normal and are actually contributing to reduced costs now. I think these are fascinating to kind of see what's been driving it, but that blue is pretty consistent all through, and that's been rent. So when you kind of look at these numbers that we've been sharing, and you kind of, If you look at the average unemployment rate under Biden, it's the lowest of any president back to, even in including LBJ, so back to 1964. And the real wages, so adjusted for inflation, the purchasing power of wages is higher under Biden than anybody else. And we didn't show the long-term real wages slide, but Nixon, when you look at Trump and Nixon here, it sort of was the graph was a big U shape. We're at a peak now with real wages, and we were at a peak back in the 1970s, a lower peak under Nixon. But Biden is the champ. You want to be in the upper left corner here. I call this thing the prosperity matrix. This is where, and we are the most prosperous of any president on average. These wages are the production and non-supervisory wages, which are the bottom 80% of the private sector. So they're not everybody. They're not distorted by the highest wage earners. It's the bottom 80%. Pretty good proxy for the for middle-class workers.
Just as a note that in the next week or so, we're going to get the first estimate of third quarter GDP growth. That comes out, I think, next Wednesday. And then the last estimate before the election of PCE inflation is going to come out on Thursday. Those will be two more data points that are going to come in. And presumably they're going to come in sort of like what we've been seeing here, but it's something to be aware of.
This is the same axes on the chart. So the unemployment rate and the real hourly wages, each dot is a month. And this is just updated through August, not September, but the dot would be in almost the same place for September. What we're saying here is that, again, we're doing incredibly well for data back to 1964. Each of these dots is a month back to 1964. We're way up here in the corner. And a lot of these other guys up here in the corner were Biden as well. This stuff out here is mostly that pandemic distortion that Karl talked about earlier. These numbers are bogus for the most part, but I left them in there. One of the questions that often comes up is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Or if you give Trump a break, are you better off than you were before the pandemic? We have to ask that extra question this time because the 4 years ago is very unfair to Trump. If you compare to 4 years ago, Trump was way worse on nearly every measure. And then he can always say, well, that was because of the pandemic. And so I'm anticipating that, and I just go back to before the pandemic, which I think is what people mean when they say, are you better off than 4 years ago? Trump has gotten a complete pass for the pandemic, for good or ill. But when you do that, 11 of the 12 measures are better than when Biden started, which you would expect with the pandemic. And 9 of 12, though, are better than pre-pandemic, which is a shocker to most people. And these are real, meaning adjusted for inflation. And these are a lot of the numbers that Karl and I have shared with you. You can kind of do the comparison as you look at it, but 9 of the 12 are better than before the pandemic. And included in that are the real net worth, the real wages, the employment to population ratio, a lot more people working, the GDP numbers, the stock market, all better than before the pandemic. And so you can play with those numbers, but just the fact that 9 of 12 are better is shocking to most people. I think they would be so inundated with propaganda that they couldn't even believe this. You could have God come down and show them this chart, and they would say, that's not what Fox News told me. So it's not going to happen. The next one is the violent crime rate. You often hear that Republicans are the party of law and order, and not true. The Democrats have the lower crime rate. The violent crime rate has been lower under Biden than Trump. And a couple of different ways of measuring it better. So The Economist, which is run out of England, it is not a pro-Biden paper by any stretch. They are kind of now because they hate Trump. But I mean, normally they're not necessarily a pro-Democrat magazine. They're saying the economy is awesome in the United States. They're wishing that Europe could have an economy as great as the United States. They also said Trump is the bigger risk to the Americans' extraordinary economy. They use the word ruinous for his tariffs. The deporting of millions of non-citizens would also help destroy the economy. And he's cavalier about institutions like the Fed and the rule of law. Basically, for him to be president, he has to shut down the litigation that is against him, at least at the federal level. He can't do it at the state level. We'll see how that goes if he becomes president. So, and then they talk about how much the economy in the U.S. has outgrown other economies in the world. We're doing something very right. and that continued under Biden. And they're warning us that Trump's policies are a bad choice here. Any questions about this section before we go into immigration?
David, I'm just wondering, how could the U.S. help Europe and the rest of the world pull them along too? I know they complained about the Inflation Reduction Act hurting them. How do we tie that into them that helps them too? That's
by keeping our economy strong. We import about $3 trillion a year of stuff from all over the world. So not putting tariffs on our allies or our trading partners, we don't want to do that. Now, Biden did retain some of the tariffs that Trump put in. He could remove those. Now, that could be politically contentious, but we're talking about how can we help Europe and some of our trading partners running big deficits so our economy is strong, getting rid of tariffs. Those are two huge things that we can do to help the rest of the world and keep them growing along with us. But making the American consumer strong, that's a great way to do it. Student loan forgiveness, giving 40 million people another 10 to 20,000 in net worth, 40 million households would boost the whole world's economy, at least a little bit. The reason we've got a section in here on immigration is because this is one area where, first of all, it's critical to the economy, and I'll go through the reasons why, but it's also like the number one campaign issue, and it favors Republicans, and Democrats are very afraid. We've been sort of drawn into the Republican sandbox because the Republican measure of success is, have you secured the border? And that is not, and that's what we argue about. Yes, we're doing X, Y, and Z to secure the border, blah, blah, blah. That isn't the argument I think we should make. And from an economic standpoint, let's put the politics aside for a minute. There is a very strong economic argument to be made for immigrants, as the economist just mentioned there. You can destroy your economy, especially when 4-point-something million boomers are turning 65 every year. You can do a lot of damage to your economy by not bringing in immigrants. Immigrants have been filling a lot of the jobs and powering this recovery that we've had. And you're going to see some numbers in here that are going to shock you in terms of how big a contribution immigrants make to the economy. And I'll show you the data. It comes from like the Congressional Budget Office, so the best source of data you can get. Here are some of the talking points. Immigrants forecast to add 65,000 per household to income and wealth over the next decade, or 9 trillion in GDP. That's a huge number, huge. And if you block immigrants, you don't get that. Immigrants are key to our ongoing boom, accounting for about a fifth of our GDP growth since before the pandemic. That's because they're the ones filling the jobs that the boomers are vacating. Immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than native-born. So there have been some very well-publicized examples of immigrants attacking locals. That always happens. It's a large 300 million country, but overall, immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than the native-born. And also overall, violent crime is lower, as I pointed out earlier. This was surprised me too. The number of undocumented immigrants, you keep hearing that Trump's like, 20 million people have come in. You hear like that there's this invasion of immigrants. The New York Times is reporting that the number probably hasn't changed very much. And I'll show you that the real number coming in is more like 8 million over the past 3 or 4 years. And because a lot of immigrants have turned 65 and are going back to their home countries, the number hasn't really changed very much. And that's where I say the 8 million have crossed the border, but about half of them get caught and sent home. And I'll show you the breakdown of the border activity. The real problem we actually do have, if you want to say there's a border crisis, we have a 3.7 million backlog in our immigration court. These are people that came here, they arrived, most of them got caught by the Border Patrol, and then they were released pending a hearing because our courts, we don't have a place to hold them, and our courts don't have the capacity to process them. And so there's this huge backlog that's going on. But that isn't the crisis the media is talking about. It's all about the borders being overrun. We need a wall, blah, blah, blah. That's all baloney. Here's the slide from the CBO where they talk about the numbers and where they're coming from. Not only do they talk about the giant contribution to income, because immigrant spending is our income, right? In an economy generally, my spending is your income and your spending is my income writ large. The more immigrants we have here, the more they need stuff and we have to produce it, or they produce it and we consume it. Either way, it's income for the country. They also are paying taxes. And the net taxes they're paying in are about $1 trillion over a decade. So things like Social Security, Medicare, benefits they don't get, those things are actually better funded because those immigrants, if they're working, are paying the payroll taxes that go in there. So if we have those people blocked, we're not going to get that income and wealth. And you'd have probably a severe recession if you blocked those immigrants coming in, because you'd have 4.4 million boomers retiring, coming out of the labor force every year, and nobody to replace them. So your number of people working is shrinking, and the income in the economy is shrinking. It's a recipe for a recession. One of the ways that the Republicans will fearmonger this is they will say they're taking jobs from the native-born Americans. They're taking jobs in code from white people. What's happening, though, is the native-born employment to population ratio is the highest it's been in the past 20 years. That blue line is higher than it's ever been, at least going back to the year 2000. Okay, so they're not taking your jobs. What's happening is the boomers, who are mostly white, older people, are retiring, and they're being replaced by brown people who are coming in as immigrants. This is the slide I shared that showed about a fifth of our growth is from the foreign-born workers, from immigrants, over the past few years. So it's accounting for a very large share of, the excess growth that we've had over others in the past few years. And so I guess going back to a question that came up earlier, what could these other countries do to help their economy? Let in more immigrants. Let your economy grow your economy by bringing in a lot of immigrants. This is another slide that just shows the violent crime rate is down 26% from the Trump peak, and also the crime rate for the native-born is higher than the crime rate for the undocumented immigrants, because undocumented immigrants are maintaining a low profile. They don't want to be caught. They want to work. They're here to make money, and they commit crimes at a lower level. Notice also that you'll sometimes hear Republicans will say every undocumented immigrant is a criminal. That's technically not accurate. If they turn themselves into the Border Patrol, which about half do, and get released into the country pending a hearing, they are here legally. This gives you the statistics on what happened. So about 8 million unauthorized immigrants showed up at the border. 6.5 million of those got taken into custody. 1.6 probably snuck in, is the estimate they've used for decades, and nobody spotted them. So of those 6.5 million, about 3 got released into the US, about 3 got sent right back home, and the other 0.8 here, they caught as criminals, and they put them into transferring to ICE is really incarcerating somebody. And back during the pandemic, we had Title 42, which allowed us to ship back a lot of people. Biden doesn't have that authority anymore, and he can't just invoke it for no reason. So we have this real problem to figure out, which is, how do we deal with this 3.7 million backlog that we have? And that requires legislation. You can't fix that with an executive order. You can slow down the pipeline, but you still have years of backlog that require Congress to fund more court officers and more personnel to process all those immigrants. This is the slide that it's an excerpt from the New York Times article that says because people are leaving, the number of undocumented immigrants is not jumping. This was, by the way, part of their journalism section, not an op-ed. And then you can see some of the trends in the border encounters. Even though Biden did this, the Republicans were saying Biden can secure the border with, an executive order, which was not true. He could do it a little bit. Most of the drop off in the activity at the border was before the June 2023 or June 2024 executive order. And it's because the economy has been slowing. The unemployment rate has been rising. Fewer people are coming here for jobs. So those are some things to think about with immigration. When you hear people arguing about border security, that is not the real issue. There isn't a problem at the border. Our people can catch them. The problem is really if we don't let in enough immigrants, that's the real problem. So that's what Democrats have to kind of start talking about, that as immigrants as a source of prosperity. We're a nation of immigrants. Unless you're a Native American, Navajo tribe, or others, you are not from here. Your ancestors are not from here. And that's how we build a strong economy, especially now with an aging country. We need those young immigrants here in a big way. Any questions on immigration before we move into the last section, the proposals?
Right, David, this is Mark Lundholm again. Recently, I was up in Minnesota, visiting some relatives, and Minnesota's become more and more diverse. And you see lots of Somali people have gone into Minnesota.
Yeah.
It's really incredible. And I don't see that as a problem. And I know one of our state senators said we need more immigrants. I can't say so, but we need people coming in. And the more diverse we are, the better we will be.
And that's where, that's where strong leadership makes a difference. And in the last, few months, because Kamala Harris doesn't have a long runway, she can't really engage on this, but as president, she can start to redefine the narrative from the bully pulpit that the measure of success should be how many immigrants we integrate and not whether we have so-called border security. It's our ability to bring them in and integrate them into our society. And it shows in our success because we've been doing that in the last 4 years. We've let them come in, we've put them to work.
Yeah, that's true.
The evidence is everywhere. We're doing way better than the rest of the world.
The European countries are small. They can't accept lots of people. And we can. We've got a lot of room here.
Yeah.
And we can do that.
Yep. One of the crazy statistics I heard, and I may be off by a little bit, so bear with me, but I think it's Iowa. Has about the same size as Bangladesh. Iowa has like 3.5 or 4 million people, and Bangladesh has 160 million. So Bangladesh has 40 times the population, and lately Bangladesh has actually been a real economic success story over the past decade. Most people think of it as that country that gets wiped out by the typhoons and is filled with desperately poor people, and there's a lot of poor people there, no doubt. But the economy has been really turning it around, and the idea that we don't have space for immigrants, we clearly have plenty. Now, can Germany absorb as many as we can? No, clearly, but I think they've got more room. I think a lot of it is local politics. Like, look at the UK, shot themselves in the foot on Brexit just because of immigration. And we're very close. We very well, because of immigration and racism, may pick Trump and shoot ourselves in the foot just like we did a few years ago. It could very easily happen. The election's a toss-up by most standards, and in part because we have not fought this battle about immigration properly. It's a real hot point for Republicans, and it shouldn't be. We should defuse that bomb in the next administration.
Well, one of the things we need to remember is that Trump was not always against immigration. In fact, on his way out the door, he granted temporary status for 18 months to 200,000 Venezuelans.
He may need a non-extradition country, so I'm not sure if Venezuela is extraditing or not. So we'll see. So Harris has put forth a lot of plans. The source is in the lower left corner. I'm summarizing them here at a high level. We're not going to go through every one, but it's here for your reference. But there is a lot of things that benefit families. I'm going to focus on that upper right corner for a second. Expanding the child tax credit up to $6,000. It's around $3,000 or $3,600 now. Expanding the earned income tax credit, which helps low-income families. Building a lot more rental units and homes to help bring those prices down. Offering a large incentive for first-time home buyers. And assisting families with childcare costs. One of the challenges you have with that fourth bullet is if you offer $25,000, but you don't expand the number of units, you're going to see prices jump. If you do that along with the supply expansion, you can keep the prices from moving. They might not go down a lot, but they won't go up as much. So it's a lot of it is about, and this is something that's been sort of a new idea, it's real supply side economics, meaning expand your workforce with immigration, build a lot more housing, put a lot more supply in the economy, a lot more capacity. That's something that always, when you hear supply side economics, that word has been taken over by the right to mean tax cuts. That's not what real supply side economics is. It's about expanding economic capacity. And you do that is not just by tax cuts. That's part of it, but it's not, you can do a lot on the supply side without that. And these are some examples. And for example, if you also, by assisting families with childcare costs, women are typically the caregiver at home. More of them could work if they had better childcare support, because a lot of women just stay home because childcare is so expensive. You make it cheaper, they can go to work, grow the economy, etc. So as you can imagine, the Democrats have much better healthcare policies. We don't know what Trump's going to do. He doesn't even have it as one of his main platform items. And for years he tried to, get rid of the Affordable Care Act probably because of Obama. Everything that Democrats are doing is funded by raising taxes on the rich. Our increases, I'll show you in a slide here in a minute, are just nowhere near as big as the Republicans because they're not going to cut spending very much, but they're going to cut taxes a lot. Here's Trump's Agenda 47, as he calls it, 47th president. You can see it on his platform at the lower left. And it's what you would expect. Tax cuts, but big tax increases, which are tariffs. Tariffs are big tax increases. People are going to pay a lot more for goods, and those tariffs are going to go to Uncle Sam. So they are tax increases. He's got some interesting ideas, which I happen to like eliminating the tax on Social Security benefits, eliminating a tax on tips, and which Kamala Harris is matching. There's that, but then he's got the bad ones, the immigration, sealing the border. Surprisingly, he's saying he's not going to cut Social Security and Medicare benefits, but at the same time, he's saying he's not going to raise taxes to pay for them. Those are not logical. You have to do one or the other. He's proposing a lot of other stuff to help businesses, but we'll see. What the economists are saying about what this means, the left-hand side is, it's the dollars. The right-hand side is the percentage. They're saying that the taxes are actually going to go up. And if you include the tariffs, the taxes are going to go up for the bottom 95% roughly. And that top 5% is going to see a tax cut. So what happens there is the rich people are going to buy about the same amount of stuff and they're going to pay some taxes with the tariffs, but they're going to get the giant tax cuts because Trump's going to extend his Tax Cuts and Job Act for them. Harris is not going to do that. And then Americans, the poor, and this is on the right-hand side, is just the percentages, which are much higher, at the bottom. In terms of the deficit impact, these are ranges depending on how many policies get put in. Harris could have no impact, meaning her stuff could be fully funded all the way up to an $8 trillion increase in the deficit or debt. The central estimate is that 3.5. And the central estimate for Trump is 7 with a maximum of 16, meaning if his stuff goes in and really damages the economy, then you could see a very large increase in the deficit. And this is over 10 years. So Harris much preferred, and the CRFB is not a liberal organization. They are very much a nuts and bolts fiscal responsibility organization. And then there are details here that go into where those numbers come from in total, and you can kind of see all the things that Harris is proposing, and some of the big ones are at the top. So if you make less than 400,000, she wants to extend the Trump tax cuts for you. Like Biden, she has pledged not to raise taxes on people that make less than 400,000. And so relative to the baseline that's out there already, which assumes that all the tax cuts are expiring, they're supposed to expire for individuals after 2025. By extending them for the bottom, that adds to the deficit. That's how that math works. And that goes, there's a whole list of them here. I won't go through them all, but if you're interested, you can read them. A lot of good stuff, because all that money is helping people at the bottom to a great extent. There's the Trump plan, the large number being at the top, and those are tax cuts that disproportionately benefit the rich. But some of the next few lines, exempting overtime, ending taxes on Social Security, exempting tips for income from taxes, those are all helpful to the middle class. But watch out for that. As much as that is helpful, keep in mind, and that's why I showed you those other charts, that red box there, those are the tariffs. Those are going to hit the middle class because they're the ones paying more for all the goods, the imported goods that they buy from Walmart and other places. So he's offering with one hand to do some tax cuts and then raising taxes on the middle class with the other. Harris has nothing like that. The middle class is only getting benefits under Harris. This is another look at the debt increases. So the cumulative amount of those deficits just from another organization. Again, the big numbers for Trump and much smaller numbers for Harris. And then some history with Trump and Biden, kind of what their policies have added to the debt. Biden much less than Trump. Here's another comparison from another organization just showing some of those same numbers, just a little bit bigger print, easier to share. If you use Twitter, the square shows up much better on Twitter. You can cut and paste, these sections and post them very easily to show kind of how they do it. If you don't follow Stephen Ratner, this guy down here, he is the charts guy for MSNBC. The charts are credible from great sources, and it's really easy to see. If you just follow him on Twitter, you can get a bunch of the slides that I use because I grab a lot of his and throw them in here. He's a great source of information. And even if you don't have a Twitter account, you can just go and look at Stephen Ratner's account, and you're going to find a bunch of good charts out there. So just to wrap some things up here, in 2023, when you look at all the key measures and compare them to 2019, they're better. The only one that was marginally better is the real median household income. Median means half the people above, half below. It's a really important statistic. There's some data that indicates the 2019 numbers were probably a little distorted. That survey was taken in February or March of 2020 when the pandemic had started to hit. So even the Census Bureau that puts this data out has some caveats to it now, but still, it's pretty close. The numbers aren't that far off, but that's one measure in Trump's court. All the rest are in Biden's court. And these aren't little minor numbers. The unemployment rate, job creation rate. I think this is probably the most important measure of how the economy is doing at any given point in time. That change in the number of jobs is huge and better under Biden, even after every adjustment you can think of. This is just the same data in a bar format that Bill likes. This is the Bill chart. So we have this here for him. And then here are some links for you that link you to some stuff on Twitter, some articles about how the economy does better under Democrats. And you can, when you're using the PowerPoint, I think we share the PowerPoint. You can go to any of those and click to go to any of those sources. And if you've got a PDF, then I don't think you can use the PDF. You'll have to actually just brute force it and type it in or search for it. Like with the articles, you can just search for the title and you can go from there. So that ends our prepared remarks.